Is your organization at risk of or currently facing some form of disruption, but you don't have a systematic way to identify, evaluate, and track that risk over time? If so, then this video is for you. In a previous video, I highlighted the concern that organizations that practice strategic planning rather than strategy risk being disrupted at some point in their future. And the risk may not be spotted by the techniques and perspectives often associated with the discipline called strategic planning. I use this diagram to highlight that unless you use an appropriate approach to developing your strategy, you may only realize that your organization is being disrupted when it hits some form of inflection point, which signals the start of a potentially terminal decline. In this video, I'll share some specific strategy tools and frameworks that you can use to spot potential disruptions well before an inflection point kicks in. More importantly, I'll show you how tools and frameworks developed by different authors can be combined together to create a more holistic, integrated, and therefore useful model for specifically managing the risks of disruption over time. This disruption model itself is made up of sections taken from a broader framework that I've developed for managing your organization's overall strategy. You can find out more about that model-based strategy framework via the link in the first comment below. This disruption model embodies the lessons that I learned from working in strategy and innovation roles, which specifically sought to identify and counteract the risks of disruption in large organizations. I've also worked in startups and new corporate ventures where we specifically sought to disrupt existing markets and competition. So I've seen disruption play out from different sides. So if you need to quickly improve your ability to identify and understand disruptive risks, which may just buy you enough time to help you develop a response, then this video is for you. In it, I'll go through the steps to build a model to help you manage current or emerging disruptive threats, where the signals for such threats exist today. In this video, I don't cover off disruptive risks which may impact you in the more distant future, where the signals of disruption are much weaker or currently just hypothetical in nature. I'll also just focus on threats emerging from different forms of competition, rather than those which may result from more fundamental shifts in the wider macro environments, since I cover off quite a lot of ground in this video as it is. However, my full model-based strategy framework can help you identify the risks of disruption from those other sources and scenarios, if you need to scan wider, further and deeper than I cover off today. In this video, I'll be using a top-down modeling approach where I start off with a very simple model and then add in more detail by using different tools and frameworks from the field of strategy. We'll continue adding in more detail into this model until we reach a level where it can help us identify and clearly understand the nature, dynamics, and potential impact of different types of disruption. At some levels in this model building process, you'll have options and choices as to which tools and frameworks you want to add to your own model so that it aligns with your own organizational context. I'll start off here where I build on the very simple definition of strategy, which is that it describes how your organization gets from point A to point B. The simple definition of strategy is quite abstract, so the first step is to add more detail by zooming in on point A. Here I use the middle circle to represent your organization, and the outer one represents the external environment in which your organization operates. So now we can overlay our first optional strategy tool. One simple tool that many people often seem to use in strategy at the beginning is the SWOT analysis, which can be represented over the circles as shown. However, SWOT has its critics, who point out that it doesn't often help you delve in that deeply into your organization. I find that SWOT can help surface any prevailing views about your organization and the risks of disruption, i.e. the threats, which you can then circle back on to review at the end of this model building process to see how useful it's been in uncovering new disruptive threats. As it stands, this model represents a snapshot in time at point A, so as we build out this model, you should also develop a version for point B, representing whichever point in the future you want to think ahead to. Next, I'll divide the external environment circles into 3 separate rings as shown, so that I can present a number of different strategy tools developed by different authors in a common visual way. In this video, I'll just focus on the inner 2 rings and your organization in the middle circle. The outer ring is used to analyze the wider macro environments, which I won't use today. The first 2 rings are based on the 5 Forces framework, a classic strategy tool developed by Professor Michael Porter, published in his book Competitive Strategy back in 1980. Within this diagram, one key player who you may have noticed is not specifically represented is your own organization. It is implied that if you're an existing industry player, then your organization is just represented in that middle box, unless you see yourself as a potential new entrant or substitute. So with our model, I'll split that middle box in two just to separate out and make it more clear that there's a difference between your organization and that of your main industry competitors. I'll also just add a little color for contrast. I find that with many strategy tools, it often helps if you rearrange or alter the original diagrams to better align or fit them together. With some strategy tools, the arrangement of the various components or connecting lines is intentional and conveys some meaning. But with many others, the arrangement is less important, so the components can be rearranged and combined without losing too much of the essential meaning that the authors are trying to convey. So next, I'll rearrange some of these boxes on the page so that Porter's 3 different types of competitors are at the top. That just creates a bit more space in the middle of the page for us to build out a more detailed model of our organization and its relationships with its suppliers and buyers. In some situations, you may face the risk of disruption emerging directly from your suppliers or buyers. But in this video, I'll just focus on the risk of disruption coming from 3 forms of competition shown at the top. Next, I'll add in a useful framework from Professor Clayton Christensen, who is generally credited as being the first researcher and author to clearly describe how different types of disruption play out over time. In his classic book on disruption, The Innovator's Dilemma, Christensen describes what he calls 2 types of disruptive playbooks, where he details the telltale signs that a competitor may be following a strategy which will end up disrupting your organization or wider industry. One of those playbooks aligns to the new entrants box on Porter's 5 forces model, and the other playbook aligns with the substitute box. Christensen's definition of disruption is quite narrow, and later on he expressed concerns that the term was being overused and his insights diluted. So just be aware that different people have different definitions or understandings of what is meant by the term disruption. Now, if you work through Christensen's playbooks, you will realize that we still need to build in a greater level of detail into our model to really identify precisely how a disruptive playbook will attack or undermine your current source of competitive advantage. To move to the next level of detail, you have 3 options to choose from. Either another tool from Michael Porter called the value chain, the business model canvas, or some combination of the 2. I'll start with Porter's value chain framework, which he published in his book Competitive Advantage in 1985. This is a follow-on to his earlier book, Competitive Strategy. In this diagram, I'm highlighting how we can overlay the value chain diagram over the single box we previously used to represent different organizations. The additional granularity that this tool provides in our model then becomes clear. We can also overlay another one of Porter's concepts, which is the value system, which acknowledges that some degree of your competitive advantage may be derived from the uniqueness of your supply chains and distribution channels. The value system perspective reminds us to watch out for the risk of disruption occurring upstream or downstream of our organization, which may have a material impact on us. Whilst this model is now getting quite detailed, I usually find that the value chain diagram on its own doesn't quite provide enough focus on the key elements of your business that a disruptive competitor may target. It's not that Porter doesn't consider those factors, as he covers them off in some detail in the chapters of his book. It's just that not all those factors that he identified in his writings are represented in his diagrams. One of the reasons that I think Porter's value chain seems to have fallen out of general use in business is because it seems to have been supplanted by the business model canvas, published in the book The Business Model Generation in 2010. The business model canvas adds that additional level of focus on the value proposition, which is missing from the value chain diagram and is often a key factor in any disruptive playbook. So, should we therefore just ditch the value chain model and switch it out for the business model canvas? I'd argue that it's worth spending a bit of time to compare the 2 side by side, to understand where they are the same, similar, or different. Whilst the business model canvas adds a useful focus in certain areas, it loses some of the more holistic, integrated, organizational perspective that Porter's value chain provides. I usually either just use the business model canvas or some combination of the 2, as they're easier to decompose into the next level of detail where we need to focus on the value proposition box. To drill down into the value proposition box, I usually start with the choice between two established strategy frameworks, which are the value proposition canvas and the blue ocean strategy canvas, or again, I use some combination of the two. The value proposition canvas was published by the same authors of the business model canvas, and so it aligns with it well already. The value proposition canvas also incorporates a useful concept refined by Clayton Christensen, which is his job to be done perspective, which helps prompt you to identify a customer's true underlying need when they are selecting between different value propositions from different types of competitors. This job to be done perspective is particularly useful if you're trying to spot the risk of disruption from a substitute competitor who may come up with a new, unique, and therefore disruptive way to solve your customer's underlying needs. That new solution may directly compete with your solution, or it may just make it redundant. The Blue Ocean Strategy Canvas, on the other hand, has more of a focus on highlighting the differences in the elements of your overall value proposition when compared with that of your competitors. It also helps identify what might be unique. The underlying matrix that this tool is based on has been around for decades, but the Blue Ocean authors have added an extra useful dimension to it, which they call the 4 Actions Framework. The 4 Actions Framework helps highlight what aspects of your value proposition you could consider eliminating, reducing, raising, or creating when compared to what your competition currently provides. It also therefore provides a very useful way to evaluate any new emerging disruptive threat from a new entrant or a substitute. These 4 actions align well with the concepts that Porter first highlighted regarding the need for trade-offs in order to develop a competitive strategy based on differentiation in your value proposition. Differentiation is one possible defense against disruption, as well as a pathway to new uncontested markets, which is a primary focus of the Blue Ocean strategy. And finally, difference in value needs to be understood in terms of price and cost, which the bottom 2 boxes in the business model canvas help you analyze. These boxes can be explored in more detail using a number of different strategy tools, economic cost curves, and other financial models, which I'll only just touch on now. It's often at this level of modeling and analysis that I find that it finally becomes clear if a competitor is developing a new strategy playbook which will disrupt your value proposition, business model, or overall value system in the future. So I'm going to wrap it up there. At this point, you may want to circle back to your original SWOT analysis if you did that one at the start, and see if this modeling process has helped you uncover any new disruptive threats. I've hopefully shown you enough to get an idea of how different tools and frameworks can be combined together to help you spot how different disruptive playbooks may lead to your organization being disrupted in the future. There are also quite a few other tools and frameworks which can be layered over this model for looking further into the future, broader into the external environment, or deeper into the operating models, which are included in my full model-based strategy framework. If you'd like help setting up and applying this framework within your own organization to manage the risk of disruption, then do reach out to me for a conversation. What have you got to lose?